everybody, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Batja Mesquita to present for us today in IPSR. Dr. Mesquita is a professor of psychology at the University of Leuven in Belgium. She completed her master's and PhD in psychology at the University of Amsterdam and did a postdoc at University of Michigan. Dr. Mesquita's current research focuses on the interplay between emotions and culture, including the role of emotions in multicultural societies. Dr. Mesquita is also the director of the Center for Cultural and Social Psychology at the University of Leuven. In her career, she's been a consultant for UNICEF and the World Health Organization. Today, Dr. Mesquita will be presenting on the mind and hours models of emotion to investigate emotional processes in non-Western cultures. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Mesquita.
Hold on a second.
Thank you. Thank you, Kylie, for that wonderful introduction. I want to start with the movie Inside Out. And I know that especially in Berkeley, this is a well-known movie. It was a blockbuster in many Western cultures and presented 5 emotions: joy, sadness, fear, and disgust and anger, that live inside the head of a little girl named Riley. Now, each emotion, when it happens, always looks the same. For example, anger is always red, rugged, and activated. Now, I would like to suggest that one of the reasons Inside Out was so successful is that it resonates with how many of us in this culture. Okay, I thought I just hear something. Better? So one of the reasons that, no, not better? Yeah, I heard that. Maybe my. Let's do that. Is it better now? Yeah, this.
Let's try this. Is it still? It's still buzzing. Yeah. Is that? I'm sorry.
Okay. I'll have to stay a little closer to the. Better? Okay. Thank you. So, one of the reasons I think that this movie was so popular was that it resonates with how many of us in this culture think about emotions. We talk about emotions as living within us. We seek to become aware of them and properly label and identify them. We think that finding out what we really feel and accepting our true feelings makes us a more authentic and more whole as a person. And finally, we think that emotions should guide our behavior. So have a good cry when you're sad, venting your anger and not bottling it up. And when you're interested and enthusiastic, follow up on those projects. Now, in this talk, I will refer to this model of emotions as mind. A mind model of emotions thinks about emotions or portrays emotions as mental feelings inside the person and essences, which is kind of quasi. I'm glad I have some response. By essences, I mean that it has fixed properties or semi-objects. And I want to juxtapose that mind model of emotion to another model of emotions, which I will call ours. I had to scramble a little bit with the letters here, so ours emotions are relational acts outside the person or between people and situated. And let me say that I don't want to dichotomize the world. I don't think that people have either mine or ours emotions. I think that we both have insides and outsides, and so we have both mine models and ours models. But I do think that the relative emphasis on these two sides of our emotions is very different across cultures. Also want to clarify that I don't mean to imply that there is a West versus a Rest. There are, of course, many models of emotions, but I do think it's good to see that the mind model of emotion that's dominant in Western cultures is not the dominant emotion in many other cultural contexts. And in this talk, I want to highlight a few ways in which these models of emotions are different. I will first illustrate the mine and the our model for each of the dimensions, if you will, of this ours and mine model. So mental feelings versus relational acts, inside versus outside the person, and essences versus situated. And then I want to show how our understanding of emotions as mine prevails in applied setting. And in this case, I want to show you how mine versus ours emotions are used in social emotional learning programs in schools. So starting with the mental feelings versus relational acts. And I want to start showing you some of my own research, and this is very early research. I started my career doing my PhD studying Dutch and Turkish samples living in the Netherlands, and Dan probably remembers that because I presented that. Was it 30 years ago in this place? And I oriented myself with a simple task. I asked my respondents to write down as many emotion words as they possibly could in 15 minutes. And I told them that any emotion words that they could think of were acceptable. And here I'm going to show you the 30%, I shouldn't say 30%, the emotions that were mentioned by at least 30% of within a sample. And these were small samples, but just to give you an idea, this is the Dutch sample. And you can see that in this Dutch sample, the words the emotions that occurred in Riley's hat were very dominant. So this is happy, sad, fear, anger, and another kind of happy, right? There were, the Dutch list also involved love and being in love, which didn't occur, I don't even think in the second Inside Out, but we know from Phil Shaver's work that love is a prototypical emotions for European Americans too. Now look at the Turkish list. In this Turkish list, you do find sadness and fear or anxiety. There is a word that means nervousness and irritability. With some generosity, you can say that's a combination between fear and anger. But none of there is also, by the way, there's also love and sexual love, so in the category of love. But all the other words, of course, did not correspond with traditional emotions. And they fit into two categories. A number of words that are more relational, that are emotions but more relational, existing between people, maybe not more relational than love. Love could be, but there were hate, desire, and another kind of desire. And then the rest of this list are behaviors. To cry, to pity, to laugh, and then the larger list of Turkish words at the time was also help and yell. So at that time, I thought that the Turkish group was just not as good at this task. Obviously, words like crying and laughing are emotional behaviors, but not really emotions. And being the diligent researcher I was, I disregarded the words that did not refer to real emotions. And I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about what I did afterwards, but to say that I continued comparing the most common translations of what I consider basic emotions as anger, sadness, fear, happiness, and love. But look at how many of those words were mentioned by at least 30% of the Dutch, and how few of those words were mentioned in the Turkish group. So it's not that the words that I included here didn't occur in the Turkish list of words. They did. But the words that were most salient in the Turkish context were relational acts between people, not mental feelings. And in retrospect, I think I could have learned more about the Turkish way of doing emotions had I not been blindfolded by scholarly definitions of emotions that have their roots in Western folk theory. Now, many years later, Maria Gendron did a better job. She was interested in how people from different cultures perceive emotions, and she traveled to the Himba, the culturally isolated group in Namibia, and compared their emotion perception with the perception of a US community sample. What she did is she gave them pictures of emotions, 6 pictures for each of those were fax-coded pictures of fear, happiness, disgust, anger, and sadness, and then neutral faces. And what she asked her respondents to do is to put those 36 emotion pictures or those stimuli in piles of faces that looked alike. And then after they had made the piles, she asked her respondents to provide verbal labels for each of the piles. And so very simply, she asked, what is in the pile? And what she found is that the Himba actually thought that what was in the piles were a lot of acts. And these acts, the ones that she mentioned, are very much like the Turkish words in the list that I had so many years before. You also see that was much less the case in the American sample. She also found that Himba see more often acts than they see feelings, and I should say, what is the purple bar is the feelings as intended, and then the gray bar was other words that with some goodwill you can call affective. And what you can see is that this is completely not the case in the American sample. Americans do actually recognize anger and fear and sadness as in those spaces. There are now several studies that similarly show that people in small isolated communities do not perceive facial configuration as mental feelings. In one of them, the Hadza, we found similar results, but we followed up with interview data. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this data. It was actually a collaboration of psychologists and anthropologists who collaborated with local scholars. And here you see, and these are pictures of the Hadza. They live in Tanzania. I don't know if I said that. And this is Katie Human in the field. She is now an assistant professor at the University of Kansas, and I can proudly say that she was my former postdoc. She was interviewing a respondent with the help of a local scholar. And so we asked them, the Hadza, tell me something that made you feel good or bad as a way of prompting emotional episodes. And then she also asked them some other questions, if they didn't already mention them, to bring the situation to life. Now, in this research, we contrasted the way the Hadza talked about their emotions with narratives from an archival set of interviews, semi-structured interviews on emotions that I collected in North Carolina when I lived and worked there. And in analyzing the emotion stories for the Hadza and the North Carolinians alike, we followed an iterative review process in which we identified inductive themes. And I'm not going to very carefully follow those inductive themes, but to say that when you follow them and when you look at the data bottom up and not top down, not based on a priori expectations, that you find that the Hadza and the North Carolinians talk about their emotions in a very different way. And I'm going to read you two examples. They're not exactly comparable, but it's just to show you that there are lots of mental reference to mental feelings in the North Carolinian sample. And obviously there are many more examples in the article if you're interested. But this is an excerpt from a North Carolinian respondent. I felt really small at the time and humiliated and everything. And everybody was looking at me. I felt like this isn't happening. And then I felt horrible. And I was terrified to get these people injured. I felt worthless and stupid. I was like, how did I do that? I felt horrible. So lots of references to mental feelings. On the other hand, if you look at the Hadza, you see that, first of all, this is a very concrete situation. And I will say that almost all the situations that they report were about hearing elephants, finding honey, so very, very concrete situations. But this respondent says, when we heard elephant screams, I was just shouting until my voice was hoarse because I was helping everyone to escape to the mountain. So a situated action with very little reference. And to me, actually, we started writing this paper because to me, as a person raised in a Western culture, it was just striking to read those narratives with almost no reference to mental feelings. Now, of course, our models of emotion do not preclude that people feel something inside, but they just do not give those feelings much importance. And that, I'm not going to show it because of time, but that is actually very clear in parenting narratives and interview. For example, the work of Chi Wang, where she shows that Western parents or American U.S. parents in this case focus on their children's mental feelings, and parents in her case Chinese in Taiwan focus on what their children do and the social consequences. Okay, I have arrived at the second dimension, which is that emotions are inside the person or outside the person. Now, my friend Shinobu Kitayama tells me that whenever he spends some time in Japan and he comes back to the US, where he lives most of the time, he has real trouble answering the question, how are you feeling? It is as if he needs to zoom into his insides again. But the question is, where else could your attention be if you were talking about emotions? Well, we found in multiple studies that people can see emotions as primarily happening between people in the social world. Emotions, in other words, can also be outside the person. For instance, in a study that Taka Masuda did with collaborators, and that included me at the time, we found that Westerners perceive an individual's emotions, so that would be the middle person, from the facial behavior of that individual. But that Japanese also consider the emotions of the surrounding people. So if the middle person was happy, like you see on the left, and the other people were angry or sad, then the Japanese felt that the middle person was less happy. And I'm showing you one graph out of the many that I could be showing, but what you can see is that the middle person in Japan is the green bars here, that the middle person is considered less happy when the other people are angry, sad, or neutral than when the other people are happy. And in fact, the Japanese seem only as happy as the Americans when the other people are happy as well. you can also see that for the American sample, the emotions of the other people really didn't matter. And in fact, we did eye tracking research, and we found that Americans really just gazed at the middle person, and Japanese went back and forth. Now, in a study inspired by news coverage of the Olympic Games, Yukiko Uchida and her colleagues examined when American and when Japanese athletes talk about their emotions. And she started with an analysis of newspaper reports, and she found that when an interviewer asked Japanese or American athletes something about emotions, obviously they both talk about emotions. When the interviewer asked them about other people, Japanese talk about emotions, Americans do not. And you can see that if the question is about neither, then emotions are not very prevalent. In another study, Yukiko Uchida and her colleagues examined whether American and Japanese participants, or when American and Japanese participants see most emotions in athletes. And she showed them pictures of athletes by themselves and then the same athletes in a team. So this is a Japanese athlete by himself and in a team, and this is an American athlete and in the team. And what she found is that American descriptions of athletes for when they saw within culture athletes contained the highest number of emotional words when they talked about the individual. For Japanese, it was the other way around. I should also say that this pattern only held for the within culture stimuli, and that it was much attenuated when we looked at the other culture athletes. I don't know that they give an explanation for this themselves, but I'm not completely sure what's going on here. Now, at least you think that only Japanese see emotions between people. I think the phenomenon is much more widespread, and I've been thinking about what example I would give you, but my early research in the Netherlands, Turkish respondents often describe their emotions in terms of what happened to their honor or social status. And I'm going to show you one transcript that shows how completely in the social world this Turkish respondent's emotions are. He was just admitted to Turkey's most competitive university because he had scored really highly on the national test, and he said, was the second time that I participated in the national competition, because after the first time I quit university, I ended up in the highest percentile. This is so far the description. My extended family did not want me to compete a second time, and this would lower the chances of their own children to get into good programs. There was resentment about me participating, and so my honor was challenged. I was forced to be competitive with the children of my relatives because his honor was challenged. And that I won the competition, that's how he described it, was important to my mom. It was my mother's pride that she could use my success against lots of people. They asked her if they could see my university ID, and without me knowing it, my mom had taken it to show them. My parents had invited all their relatives and neighbors over to their house to celebrate the success. My relatives asked me questions to humiliate me. So what is going on is really the relative honor that they negotiate. Are you going to finish this time? They kissed me and wished me well, but I knew that they privately thought, damn it, you won again. And then a spicy detail, after I won the competition, many families were prepared to offer me their daughters to marry. Of course, my self-esteem increased. Okay, so clearly this young man's emotions are, he may have feelings, but what he describes is mostly emotions that are out in the world and shared in one way or another by other people. So that brings me to the third aspect of emotions, and that of the mind-hours distinction. which is that in an hours model of emotions are situated, whereas in a mind model, they're essences or semi-objects inside us that should find their way out. And so in a mind model, emotions should be expressed, and it's considered unnatural or unhealthy not to express your emotions. It's a very Freudian idea, and actually it has received a lot of support. And I will say that in this section, I highlight the work of a lot of Berkeley researchers, and in the next, by the way, in the situated. But there is a lot of evidence that suppression is harmful. In fact, emotional suppression targets, this is laboratory experiments, targets the expression, but without changing the intensity of the feeling, and it amplifies physiological arousal. And also what's been found is that suppressors have worse interpersonal functioning and less well-being. Other Berkeley researcher, Arlie Hochschild in the sociology department, started a whole research line on emotional labor, showing that employees who engage in emotion regulation in response to organizational demands to have certain emotions are more likely to experience emotional exhaustion or burnout. But the question is this universal? And the answer is probably no. In many cultures, the default is that you change your emotions to fit the context. And often this is done by adjusting to the situation and accommodating to others' expectations. And it's certainly no universal to treat emotions as invariant essences that best run their course. And I think, if anything, the metaphor here would be a chameleon. And in fact, several studies have now shown that emotional suppression and emotional labor have very different effects in cultures that consider emotions to be ours. And I want to say that a lot of this research is also done in Berkeley or by Berkeley-bred researchers. That only struck me. I mean, I've given versions of this talk, but in preparing for this one, I thought, oh, a lot of the research has actually been done right here. So in a remarkable lab study, Iris Mouse and Emily Butler, who has passed unfortunately, compared the emotional responses of European and Asian American participants to an anger manipulation and a neutral film. And they found that in both groups, individuals who valued emotional control actually suppressed their expressed their anger suppression more than individuals who didn't value emotional control. And this was, the anger suppression was actually as observed by judges who didn't know how high those individuals had scored on the emotional control scale. So valuing emotional control in both groups is a pretty good proxy for emotional suppression. Okay, so that's how you need to read this graph. But the similarities stop there. European Americans who suppressed their anger, and that was true for both conditions, reported a higher intensity of anger feelings. So really, this is consistent with the Freudian idea that bottling up your emotions is not a good idea, that your emotions will come back to haunt you, right? But emotional suppression in the Asian American group had very different effects. Those who suppressed most, or more precisely, those who valued emotional control most, were the people who reported the lowest intensity of anger feeling. Iris and Emily also looked at the results of several physiological measures, and they point in the same direction. So this is, I'm basing myself on their explanation, but here you see the results for cardiac output, and cardiac output is measured as an index to differentiate between threat, which is low cardiac output, or challenge, which is high cardiac output. And you can see that suppressing emotions was related to low cardiac output in the European American group, meaning that it was a stressful thing for them to control their emotions. But it was associated with higher cardiac output in the Asian American group, meaning that for them it was a positive thing to suppress their emotions. Now, similarly, in emotion labor research done by Alan and his colleagues, they found that display rules on the job worked very differently for US and Chinese service workers. And a first interesting finding, it's actually is that they couldn't find equivalents for the emotion labor skill that was developed in the US. Whereas in an American sample, faking was part of suppression. That was not true in the Chinese sample. So in the Chinese sample, people did not think that I fake my emotions, I fake the emotions I show when dealing with customers, had anything to do with suppressing your emotion. It has a zero loading on that factor. Now, Alan and colleagues also found that in the American sample, perceived norms to suppress negative emotions, so-called display rules, were associated with surface acting, and surface acting is the sociological word for suppression, really, and that indeed led to burnout on those different scales. They found that some people went to deep acting, so they changed their emotions themselves, and you see that the effects were not as negative. What is interesting that in the Chinese sample, when there were display rules, most of that was associated really with deep acting. So people who perceived display rules at work changed their feelings, and that is what you see with deep acting. And you can also see that that is good for well-being. You see that having display rules does not, if anything, it makes you, I don't know, that's not even, there is no correlation really between suppression and display rules. Suppression in itself does have a negative, or does have an association with burnout, so that's not different. What am I doing in time? Okay. I wanted to show you a last study that I'm just giving you because it's a larger part of the world. It's a recent study by Tamir and her research. It was done in 19 countries during the COVID-19 crisis. And the participants were students in all those countries. And they rated their emotions, their negative emotions, levels of sadness, fear, and anger during the past week. They reported their use of 7 emotion regulation strategies. Some of you may know this research. I'm going to focus on expressive suppression. And then they measured several indexes of psychological health. So in this case, life satisfaction, depressive symptoms, perceived stress, and loneliness. I'm going to show you a very complicated table that just occurred in the article, but I'll explain what it is. You don't have to see, I just want you to see that the columns here are the mental health outcomes. Can you still hear me when okay. And the rows are the different strategies of emotion regulation, right? And then within each block, you see all the association between that emotion regulation strategy and the particular index of mental health, okay? And so you see for each of the countries that participate. The blocks that are pink are in very strong are in support of cultural similarities, and the more pink they are, including the more if they have a red bar, which is none, they are in very strong support of cultural similarities, and the bluer the box is, the more evidence there is for cultural differences. Okay, I want to zoom in on expressive suppression, and what you can see is that indeed there is strong evidence, at least for 2 of the mental health indexes, that there is that there are cultural differences in the relationship. I just think this is interesting. There's one emotion regulation strategy with consistently positive links to psychological health outcomes. I don't know if you saw what the different regulation strategies were. Can you guess what it is? Nobody dares to try. Situation selection. I'm showing it.
We can do it, yeah.
The one with the one that has the, this is not it. The one that is the most, has the most similarities is emotion support seeking, which I think is really interesting. So seeking support with other people. It has nothing to do with the line of my talk, but I still thought it was interesting to show you. Okay, so I introduce you to an alternative model of emotions, where mind models conceive of emotions as mental feelings inside the person and essences. Ours models conceive of emotions as relational acts outside the person and situated. I'm not, except for that these are nice acronyms, I'm not very attached to how you describe that, but you do see that the models, there's something different going on. And what I also think is important is that mine and ours models are more than just ways of talking about emotions. They help to constitute the very emotional processes that we're interested in. Emotional experience, the perception of emotions in others, and emotion regulation. Now this year, for those of you who don't know, I'm at Stanford, and I'm working on the applied implications of these models of emotions. And I will give you an example of social emotional learning in schools. And many schools have now adopted curriculums that teach social emotional learning, and I think that's a really good thing. We want children to learn to use their emotions for good. But the curriculums that we have today are currently rooted are squarely rooted in mind models of emotions. And that means that we may not sufficiently connect to the ours models that many of our students bring to school. And I will briefly illustrate this, and hopefully in the process, making mine and ours models a little more concrete. So here are 2 models of social emotional learning left for anybody who has ever seen those. Is the CASEL model, the school curriculum. It's the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. And it's a model that has been used a lot. Right is the model for ICEL. It's international social emotional learning. It's a little more recent, and it's has been developed to be a little more inclusive. And you see that there are quite some similarities between the 2. And for example, and that's what I'm going to focus on, they both highlight self-awareness and self-management. And if you think about it, some form of self-awareness and some form of self-management must be cultivated in any society. But it's at the implementation stage that the general concepts become tailored to a mind model of emotions. And I'm going to show you the aims of social emotional learning for one of the self-awareness goals in the ICEL model. This is the goal of the ability to identify one's own emotions and values and accurately assess one's strengths and weaknesses with a strong sense of identity and self-confidence. I'm going to zoom in on the emotion part of this. And what you see here is the developmental trajectory across age. So these are specific goals or aims that they have for each age bracket. And so in the early years before kindergarten, one of the goals, one of the aims is to name your emotions, to recognize and express your own emotions. Between kindergarten and second grade, it's to recognize and name my feelings and emotions and realize that they are healthy, important, and natural. Sorry, I read it in the wrong order. Then between third and fifth grade, it's describe a range of emotions and the situations or environments that cause them and understand that they're natural, important, and healthy. And then a last example is identify between 9th and 10th grade is identify contributing factors to my emotional state and stress level. Okay, how is this mine? Well, there is a focus on emotions as mental states and how they're caused. And also emotions just occur and they're absences, I would say, they're just there and they need to be accepted. So under the magnitude, it's what they want is an awareness and an articulation of mental states, an awareness of the contributing causes of mental states, and also an acceptance of mental states as important, natural, and healthy. Okay, so very much they're there, you have to deal with them. Now, what could be alternatives? I don't have full curriculum goals based on our model of emotion, but I do want to contrast these current curriculum goals, the goals from the cell programs that we have, with some practices in other places with different models of emotions. So this is a practice created in Japanese elementary schools, where children at the end of the day reflect on what they've done wrong that day and how they could improve for the next day. It's called, the practice is called Hansei, or self-reflection, and I've been told that sign says I'm in the middle of self-reflection. And it is, if you will, a social emotional learning practice, but one that is tailored toward behaving well in the situation. So if I compare that with the mind model, there's no awareness of mental states, but an awareness of the consequences of your acts, right? No awareness of the contributing causes of mental states, but an awareness of how you can change your acts with the goal of better consequences, better social consequences mostly. And whereas accepting mental states is important in the mind model, there's no attention to mental states in this Japanese model. Now, I recently met a researcher at Stanford who is at the Spark Center at Stanford. Her name is Manisha Dawood, and she has been involved in social emotional learning. She did a postdoc with Mark Brackett for those of you who know him. And she's been working on social emotional learning in Islamic schools, or what she calls tarbiyah. And I'm not gonna, or the gradual and holistic nurturing of every human soul, and that is the mind, body, and heart. And I'm not gonna pretend I understand everything about Islamic teachings, although a little more than before I read her papers. But I recognize the idea that you can cultivate in yourself and others this tarbiyah or hikmah, the bridge between knowledge and action. And she developed a program for, this was a teacher training in Islamic schools in Australia. I'm not going to say too much about it, except for that it had some good outcomes. But her model is the heart model. And it says that Tarbiyah or Hikmah can be achieved by healing in God's presence, and that means always being mindful of God. Engaging with purpose, which means as much as living to the principles of God. Achieving with gratitude and rising with patience and humility, which is be grateful and patient in every situation. And the idea is that by being that, you will attract God's pleasure and assistance. And then lastly, thrive with compassion, which is the foundation for interpersonal relationship. Now, what is interesting, I think, about this model or this way of doing social emotional learning is that, again, it's very outward focused, but not in a way that the Japanese is. It's about discovering. It's not about. It's not about discovering emotions as you feel them inside you, but it's awareness of God's presence. It's not awareness of the contributing causes of mental states or how you can change your acts, but it's actually an awareness of how to act or live according to the principles of God. And it's also different from that last point. It's not accepting mental states as important or accepting them as they are. It's also not that they don't give attention to mental states, but it's to cultivate certain mental states, the mental states that are important in a life devoted to God. So cultivate gratitude, patience, humility, and compassion. And they also have some ideas of how to do that. And for example, 5 times a day prayer is one of those ways in which you can achieve being mindful and cultivating these mental states. So I think that there is a pan-cultural tendency to cultivate self-awareness and self-regulation, but that the understanding of emotions as mental feelings is a very specific contemporary middle-class vernacular, and that it's not as common in other cultures. I'm going to leave it at there so that we have room for discussion. Some of the ideas were in this book that is a few years old, and here's how you can reach me. Of course, interested in
to get it started. So one of the things that kind of is a theme that's throughout this incredible body of work that now, it's like 40 years, right? It's about 40 years you're working.
You're aging me.
No, 30. But anyway, is I think it started largely about what people feel, as if there were, and what they say they feel, but interspersed throughout that is a lot, especially as you get into the cross-cultural work, of how they behave and their actions. And even in that last thing where you have heart and body and mind, you see these sort of 3 things, like you could mental states, behavioral states, and then you introduced the threat and challenge work, which is not as strongly writ large in this work. But I was wondering, looking back on this, how do you think that whether it's how you have emotions or how you regulate emotions, obviously you could have suppression and say, don't show me anything, or you could say, don't feel anything, or you could say, feel more or show more. I mean, do you have a sort of a hierarchy when these different parts of emotions differ in their relations with culture? How do you know whether to emphasize one or the other? And do you think the rules of the road are quite different, or that there's a kind of a master plan here?
Yeah. There's a lot packed in that
sorry.
question, but I I think that's exactly what is different for different cultures. So the question is, to what extent does the culture ask you to change your feelings, ask you, I don't like that word because it's as if it's external to ourselves, whereas how it works is, of course, we have psychologies wherein those, wherein behaviors or feelings are prioritized. I mean, we're not, culture isn't an external, we are culture, the mind is culture. But I do think that cultures differ in the extent to which they occupy those, in which they care about how much. So the flip side of the coin of focusing on behavior is that it doesn't, in some of the cultures, it doesn't matter. Like in Japan, there is a distinction made between your internal feelings and your outside behavior. And the culture is really strictly on the outside behavior. Now, one of the most effective ways to achieve that behavior is, of course, also to reappraise or to appraise. I mean, that's obviously what people do to achieve that behavior. But in a way, as long as you stick to the cultural norms of the behavior, and you're free to think or feel whatever you want. There's also this very little, but I think interesting research, mostly in sociology and anthropology, about social class. And there too, it seems like middle class parents care about what they are much more intrusive, if you will. They regulate their kids' feelings. They have to get inside the head. Working class parents are more concerned or target more the outside behavior. So I think it's part of the culture to prioritize which part of the behavior is targeted. That said, as you know, because you've helped us with it, when we did couple research in the lab, what people reported in a conflict situation, Japanese and Belgian couples, what people reported in a video-mediated recall was pretty consistent with what we could see when we SPAF coded their behavior. So it's not like they're completely different worlds. But I do think that the emphasis is on different things. And so in part, I think the social emotional learning strategies are exactly targeting that. What is it that we find important that children learn? And I don't know everything about Japanese schools. I also know that they're starting to adopt these Western programs, so that may also change. The culture, of course, is not as dynamic, but I do think there are different focuses of culture. Is that more or less what you asked?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, whether you need to have 3 of these mine and are, whether you need to have.
Well, I'm just thinking about my next book. It's very clear to me that I need more than 2. I need more than 2 just because in my head, that's kind of clear. It's not all mine. The mine is not all the same. And, of course, there are many ways. So I tried, and I'm not the only one. Many people in this room tried to move us away from this one model. But, I'm not going to give an exhaustive list of models, probably as many as their families. But if you're really, but we could, I could sketch a few different, these were 3. It would probably be helpful if I have 5 or 6, just to stretch the range of imagination, I think. But yeah, we have many ways of dealing with our emotions, and ultimately we look at these national or religious cultures, but we could as well look at smaller cultures of families. Except it gets harder and harder to study in a systematic way. Iris was first, and then you. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I can wait till later.
Okay.
What fascinates me about this is the potential for cultural conflict. Okay, so you get in an organization like in our country, you have so many different cultures interacting with each other. And I've been in situations where and then you put them in a hierarchical organization, and if the person at the top is from the R's culture, they're giving you lots of orders that don't relate to, they can't even read the audience, because if the audience is mainly my culture, we're used to expressing ourselves, right? Right, aha, yeah, that kind of stuff. Well, give me orders, and so, oh, I'm interested in when you all finish. Because that's an action that she can read as delightful. Her statistics, it seems to me, she's made her numbers, you know? So this is just an example, but you haven't talked about that exactly, but I think it's really important to look into these things that cause conflict.
Yes. I totally agree with you, and I think it's the other way around too, that, that people with a mind model often misread people with an hours model. So there is there's absolutely a potential conflict, and it's one thing to analyze how the different models work, and then another thing to think about how could we address these topics in a multicultural environment. And I'm thinking about that. I think I don't know, I haven't solved that question. I'm exactly thinking about that, and of course so the book that I'm working on looks at these models in school context, in work context, and in therapy. And in all three, we know that there are these conflicts. We know in the workplace that there are these, I don't know that it's conflicts of these models, but it's certainly a clash of expectations. So the question is what do people do it in each of those contexts, but also what do we do when we are connected in multiple contexts? And I don't have the ultimate answer to it, but I think a start anyway is to look at to understand that there are these different ways of looking at emotions and of dealing with emotions. And I'm thinking that I was just talking to Oz about it, that some curiosity and humility towards different ways of doing it will go a long way. But that's exactly, you catch me exactly where I am in the thinking of what is my message to a larger field. I do think that people with hours emotions in a society where all the models come from mine emotions really suffer at this point. I mean, we know that mental health services are inadequate for people from different cultures. This could be one of the reasons that they are. We don't really know, because we don't collect the data, how well kids from other cultures with another cultural different background do in school curriculum program. I've looked for them. We don't collect those data separately. So I mean, I think we have a long way to go. My idea is that asking the right questions is a first step, but I agree with you that we're a long way from resolving that. Not to mention that the political climate is not with us. But
I just want to say it's been very insightful hearing these two models, that I'm starting to understand some of the conflict.
yeah, I often hear from I do often hear from I mean, after I wrote my last book, I spoke to educators, therapists, and people in the workplace, and what I hear from them are these kind of misunderstandings. And the question is, how can we be more open to these different models? Sorry, you can go first.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really insightful, and you kind of answered a little bit of my question. You mentioned that you applied these models to educational spaces, workspaces, and I think a very fertile ground would also be the relationship space. I was really struck by those differences in how people narrate and make sense of their emotions. The process of narration, the process of meaning making. And I'm wondering how this might play out in, for example, interracial couples, intercultural couples. We're living in a highly globalized society now, and just not even from one could be the romantic relationship space, but just an intergroup relationship space. And I'm wondering if you have any other sort of thoughts how people can equip themselves with, for example, mental models or other types of social emotional skills that might make them, more ready and perhaps more curious, more humble, perhaps more aware about these differences and how we can best be able to navigate different models in other people, right? The course together.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I just, my guess is as good as yours because we don't have very much research on the topic. I have a former student, a professor at the University of Amsterdam, Michael Boyger, who's doing that kind of work, interracial, or as we call it in Europe, inter-ethnic, intercultural couples. And there again, I mean, that is exactly what you do. His hypothesis is, but he's collecting data, is that knowing there is a cultural difference, so knowing there is something to understand, is an important step towards resolving the issues, because then you can say, then you can stop making attributions within your own system of meaning, but you can open up to a different system of meaning. But I think many people are collecting the data for themselves at this point. It would be good if we as psychologists did too. But the empirical answer is we don't know. And the sort of conceptual answer, the way I think we have, I mean, you can't prescribe, you can't say, so there has to be something of a cultural awareness and a humility and a curiosity of finding out, is what I think. But the research is being done as we're speaking. So.
Iris? I was really curious about the implied dichotomy between mind and ours models. It strikes me that they don't necessarily have to be in conflict, especially when you came to the application piece. I was thinking, what if we taught children to have both, to have the inner awareness and also the relational awareness? So other people or countries or cultures that are kind of in the high quadrant, but is that sort of like the ideal place to be?
Well, I mean, I don't think, as I said in the beginning of the talk, I think that we have interiors and exteriors, and ideally we pay attention to both, right? So we all have, I mean, one way to say it is maybe in some contexts we're more focused on the mind model, but actually there is an ours model for us too. That's one way of saying it. So when it comes to, we have interiors and exteriors, and they're both worth paying attention to, yes. There's some ideas that are conflicting. For example, when you say suppressing your emotions is a bad thing, you need to have your emotions out, or you have to accept your emotions in a similar vein. I think you have to accept and normalize your emotions versus you have to cultivate other emotions. There is a choice to be made, or you have to, or you can ignore them. They're just not important. There is probably a choice to be made, and so I don't know. I haven't thought it out. So in general, I think no. Mine and ours. The mine and ours distinction that I made in my book was really to say, look, you may be thinking of only feelings, but we understand, and many of the people's work in this room are about that. You understand much more of your emotions if you see what role they fulfill. I mean, I think of Decker's work, and you understand much more of what they really are when you understand what relational function they have. But there are parts of it, I think, that are very Western colored. And that's mostly about, are they there to be accepted, or can we acculturate, or can we, sorry, not acculturate, that's not, can we adjust to the situation, accommodate the similarities? So that would be my short answer, I think. But there again, as I said, I joked about it and said I'm not very attached to the acronyms. I really am not. I think what is good to know is that the way we, and even we as psychotherapists, as educators, as people who teach businesses, we are married to a certain model of emotions. We may be the practitioners, maybe not even necessarily. That is very specific. That's very unique for this part of the world, and then probably for the middle class educated class of that. So we have to be aware of that. And I tried, with those acronyms, I tried to get people away from the line. It totally doesn't mean that I think there are two kinds of people in the world.
Great talk. I just wanted to get your thoughts on when we use language-based measures, which a lot of this work is based on, what are we saying about emotion? In the classic models of emotion, there are all these different processes going on, and then there's symbolic representation, Klaus Scher and others. And I think there are a lot of reasons to be suspicious of whether it really maps onto emotion per se, experience, feeling, behavior, social dynamics. There's Nisbet and Wilson. We just come up with these theories, and then there's what really happens in life. Brian Parkinson's critiqued the appraisal literature. I think in some sense, right? Like, we tell these retrospective stories about why we felt something, and that's got a lot of biases built into the measurement of it. And I guess it's a couple of questions. One is the meta question of, like, what do these kinds of data say about, your view of what emotions are? And then I think when you, some of the mental state findings where if people use words to describe how they feel, I feel embarrassed. And then you just take it as a default that's only has an interior reference, right? I think there are a lot of reasons to think that it projects outward to social objects and intentions. Phil Shaver's work suggests that the word anger is a statement about relationality. So how do you grapple with those issues of the meaning of language?
You guys have complex questions. Yeah. The language to experience relationship is a very hard one. On the one hand, I think, there are different parts of your question, I think. One is when people choose a certain interpretation of what they feel, is it just a label? And, I think it's not just a label, it's a commitment to a certain way. It's a focus. So that's one way of saying it's not just, it's not just talking to others. It's when I commit to a certain interpretation, I'm also following the script that comes from that interpretation. I do not infer the fact, I don't think that when people say I'm embarrassed or they are embarrassed, that they necessarily refer to a mental feeling. In fact, there's quite a bit of anthropological literature that shows that people in some cultures use emotion words to exactly they don't privilege the mental feeling. It doesn't matter what you feel, as long as your honor was violated and you do a number of things, then that's called shame or embarrassment. So I don't think that merely using the word is going to point you to whether they prioritize or privilege mental feelings. But I do think that a lot of other practices do show you that there is a difference in emphasis, and so it's not one. It's not one set of data that shows it. It's the combination of data, and so that's what I've tried to do in my book. It's convergent evidence. I thought you would go to the large language models. Katie Guman and I, at some point thought, well, you know what? We're going to look if large language models show this difference in emphasis of ours and mine cultures, and we couldn't even agree on the domain of the emotion. So it was the project is still somewhere in the back burner, but it became really hard in in the concrete in the specifications. So I think it's, I don't think that the use of words, to come back to that, in itself is evidence. I think it's the use of words in combination with the choice of regulation strategies, in combination with the kinds of consequences that people see coming, in combination with what we did with the hot cell work, doesn't seem that the hot cell people, that they actually, that their whole conceptualization is not about the emotions, but it's about the situation of finding honey. So we said, you had these good feelings. Can you give us a situation where you had even better feelings? And he didn't say another situation where they were happy. They said, yeah, that time that I found even more honey. So that sort of tells you that it's, but I'm also not sure when I'm making the distinction, that's kind of a distinction, a conceptual distinction that we need to keep in mind when we look at data, I think. It's not that everybody's like, obviously the Japanese are not like the hot stuff, right? It's extreme. The Japanese have a lot of emotion words. Words alone are not going to give it to you. If words, like I just said in response to Bob's question, if words converge with behaviors, or if words or ways of talking converge with physiology, we can have a little more evidence. If people systematically choose to put emphasis on different parts of the episode, I think that's a reason to think that, well, in their experience, that has more priority and more focus. But a word in itself doesn't say.
I keep thinking of the literal.
Everybody tries to not think about that.
But I think the American strategy on both sides is to arouse outrage. Outrage can be produced by images. That's why we're outraged about images that can also be images. And the model is that if you create enough outrage individually and then organize individuals together, take the actions that you can. I don't know whether outrage is a particularly American strategy, but it seems to prevail on others.
It does right now. I don't know that I have anything. I mean, the things I know are not the things, certainly not the things from my research. I do know that we know from research that high arousal stories and images are better remembered and better. I'm not actually sure how cross-cultural that research is, but we know, at least in this environment, that is what we know, that those narratives are also more reproduced and related. I'm at the Center of Advanced Studies in Stanford this year with journalists who say that they need to have these sensational stories because that increases their likes, and so that's why you get all the sensational stories in the New York Times, because they're the most successful ones. So we have at least in the society, we have a selection mechanism for that. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't know if that's always the case. There is, I can imagine that arousal, I would say, is a pretty universal thing. And when you are aroused, I would think, but, I'm talking again, you can make the story as good as I can, but I would say that if something is very arousing, that demands or commands attention. I don't know that in every culture people have the same dominant strategies to deal with arousal. So, we know that there are cultures where arousal is not as valued as it is, as in the Eastern American culture. We know that, in Buddhism, that you want to stay far away from arousal and have to work away from it. So I'm not sure what else I mean, the feature of arousal seems to be a pretty universal one. The value of arousal doesn't seem to be a very universal one.
What is the emotion of outrage? It seems to be anger plus directed at an object.
I'm not sure what the difference is between outrage and anger. I mean, I think it's probably in its use of intensity. Anger also has an object most of the time. So I don't know. I think it's an indication for. I don't think. So I'll reveal my view. I think it's a word, and people apply it in certain situations. And I would guess that outrage is applied to high intensity emotions with some moral dimension. Like outrage is when you think it's really wrong. But having said that, anger is also has a moral dimension. It also says I'm right, you're wrong. So I think it's a matter of intensity. But I haven't studied that. I'm just
It's
thinking about it.
an emotion that requires the cultural frame, the social frame. It's not just an individual emotion.
I mean, in a way, every emotion requires a social framework because we learn emotion words from our society. We are not, we're not born with those concepts. We learn them, presumably, and certainly the words in a certain language. So yes, of course, it's social and cultural.
Thank you so much for the insight.
Last question.
So, I'll keep it short one. I think it's very interesting to learn, and I think one interesting part of the system is like what is the dialogue between central emotions and more emotion, and how it can spike and then you change the course of the I think those are very interesting dialogues that come across, like political or certain images that spike emotion or certain songs and then that change the course of the song. How does that affect or if there are any thoughts to share?
I don't have any thoughts to say. That's not a good answer. I think it's an interesting idea that that certain events then spike a longer term. I don't know if you would call that an emotion or an attitude or but yeah, I mean, one of the ways in which it would is that it highlights an aspect of the situation or of your relationship with the situation. So, something that really makes you emotional stands out. So you may start paying attention to it, or it may become more important in your life. I would say that's one of the reasons that emotional events may change you in the longer run. But there are many other reasons, of course, like social reasons. But yeah, I don't know research. There is old research actually on the duration of emotions, like what the relationship is between short-term or what predicts an emotion to be longer lasting. And some of what I remember is the most predictive is how important it is to you. And of course, an emotional event makes it clear how important the issue in general is to you because you've experienced that. But beyond that, I don't think I have much to say about that. I can refer you to that literature.
Sorry, we're out of time, unfortunately, but you're going to be around for the rest of the day.
Yes. Thank you so much.